Hi, welcome back. Last week I was looking at how we use responsibility as an excuse. You know, I would, but I'm just too responsible. And this week I want to do something in a similar vein, but this time the perennial excuse that I'm going to be looking at is age. You know, I would do this thing, but I'm just too old. And on the surface, it's a pretty solid excuse, because a lot of things do seem to be obviously tilted towards favouring the young. You know, physically, we're able to do and learn things when we're young that become progressively much more difficult, if not, in a way, impossible as we get older. And certainly, I'm not for a moment going to suggest that there aren't age limitations in some senses on what we can and can't do, certainly in the physical realm. But I think with a little bit of creativity we can work around whatever those physical limitations might be, and also discover that actually, as much as our age will limit our development or learning of new things, it will also aid our development and learning in interesting ways. But I want to begin with an inspirational story, so it's nothing to do with me. And this is the story of Wang Yongfu, who's a 96-year-old Taiwanese man. And he'd fought as a soldier in the Chinese Civil War that unfolded after the Second World War in the troops of Chiang Kai-shek. And after defeat by the forces led by Mao Zedong, they ended up on the island of Taiwan, and the troops needed to be housed somewhere, and they built these sort of prefabricated concrete villages for speed of deployment. And the idea was never that they'd be that permanent, and over time the island, being a small place, started to demolish villages and develop the land. And this happened to Wang's village. Admittedly, his was right at the very end of the process. And he was well into his 80s. And he was faced with resettlement, losing his home, and he just felt he was too old. Well, he was in his mid-80s, so the thought of moving really didn't fill him with a lot of joy. And he, I don't want to say as a protest, but it seemed as a sort of an act of willful desperation, he started to do the only thing he could think of, which was paint. And when I say paint, it wasn't canvases. He started painting his village. Now, there were only a few houses left that hadn't already been repurposed, and he was, it seems, the last remaining villager. But he started painting his, I guess it began with his home and then the streets around him. It was cement, so it lent itself, you know, it was an urban canvas of sorts. And the story gained traction with the local university, who found out about him, and they started supplying him with paints, and he just didn't stop. Fast forward 10 years later, and the last 11 homes in the village were saved. And it's become an enormous tourist attraction, attracting well over 1 million visitors a year. He's become something of a celebrity, and produced a naive art canvas on a truly monumental scale. I don't want to say unique, because there are other really amazing, in the realm of outsider art, amazing sort of monumental artworks that began as a sort of lone act, creative act, for whatever reason, and just grew from there. The subject of his painting has been scenes drawn from his youth and his memory. The style, it must be said, he'd stopped any sort of form of artistic exploration before his teens. So his style is bold, kind of street art style. Think Keith Haring, I guess, is in terms of fine art the nearest equivalent, and it is quite amazing. And obviously, you know, if the scenes were amazing on their own, when you put together a whole street of this kind of unified, bright, upbeat vision, it is astounding. But there's no getting away from the fact that the most amazing thing is not the art, but it's obviously the fact that he started doing this when he was in his 80s. And he just hasn't stopped. You know, his life is painting his village, you know, centimetre by centimetre. And a truly inspiring story. And there, I think one of the wonders of our YouTube era is it's not hard to come across dozens of these. Now you might argue that, well, Neil, obviously visual arts lends itself to this, but if you were, you know, if your dream was to do something of a more sporting nature, well, you know, maybe it wouldn't be so easy, and I don't doubt that it wouldn't. But there are stories, and once again, you know, if you look into the world of, you know, the age group sports, and it is still sport, there are tons of incredibly uplifting stories. You know, there's a fantastic tale of an Australian man who, Cameron, I believe his name is, and he'd swum when he was young, and then life took hold, and that was the end of his swimming until he got to his 80s again, and he took up swimming and took it up seriously, you know, eventually setting a world record. And you know, obviously there's no comparing the physical possibility of an octogenarian in 50-metre freestyle and a young man. But for me personally, as a pretty bad swimmer, the thought of this gentleman well into his 80s swimming 50 metres freestyle in under a minute, you know, which is obviously double the time taken for you know, more than double the time taken for an Olympic athlete, but it's still quite an astounding feat, and in itself is something well worth doing. I think that actually points at one of the difficulties with these kind of age arguments, is that at the core of many of them is this idea that there's this end goal, and if it can't be that end goal, the dream is no longer the same dream. But a little bit of creativity in thinking, sure, maybe you won't become the Olympic champion anymore, but you know, that isn't to underplay the possibility of, you know, as I say, age group records, for example, or activities. And it's not to underplay the value of the process in itself. I mean, the real benefit, I guess, for Cameron, the octogenarian swimmer, is the fact that he is an incredibly healthy man, and it is his swimming is his life, in a very deep and profound sense. And in fact, you know, if someone says, but what about combining the two arguments, the argument last week of responsibility and the argument this week of age? And if you actually look at those, there's an enormous number of people in the, in inverted commas, older marketplace. And actually this presents a fantastic commercial possibility. So taking up your dream of becoming a swimmer or a football player or whatever the sport might be when you're much older presents opportunities for the creatively inclined a professional nature, as well as opportunities of fame and fortune that perhaps are more traditionally considered. Now, another element of the "I'm too old" argument is kind of the you can't teach an old dog new tricks, sort of putting it in broad terms, or that it's, maybe it might be possible, but it's a damn sight harder as you get older. And I guess language would be an area, a typical area that's brought up, language or music, as activities that really benefit enormously from beginning when you're young. And again, I wouldn't begin to deny that young children seem to pick up a language, certainly having worked at bilingual schools. Young children seem to have an amazing ability to pick up a language quite naturally. But if you scratch a little under the surface, partly it's because of whatever physiological advantages they might have in terms of neuroplasticity or development of, speech memories or their vocal cords or I don't know what. But at the heart of that argument is the fact that they are being immersed in a wonderful way through play. For me personally, my ability to pick up, and I wouldn't want to say accurately, first Spanish and then Portuguese, really benefited enormously from the fact that I was doing it in my 20s and then later in my 30s. Because I kind of realised at that point, I was doing my job, I was living my life, and I really didn't want to pursue a more traditional educational model. And eventually I realised that what I needed to do was use a similar strategy that young children were invoking, but just kind of rebooted for a mature, or in my case, older adult. So I thought, well, how can I do this like a child does it? And I said, well, one element will be copying what they're doing. And so to pick up Spanish, I went to a sort of far-flung village where I would find Spanish speakers, but unlikely to find English speakers. I had a little phrase book, and my strategy involved going into bars and talking to people, trying to get to meet them, talking about things of where I might have an overlaying interest, football, whatever, chatting up girls, and just using my phrase book, Dutch courage, and their, amusement at this weird extraterrestrial South African English speaker. And it worked brilliantly. So, I think we have advantages as an older learner that a younger person perhaps doesn't have. I mean, another thing that I sort of leveraged as an adult learning Spanish was an approach that I found in a book called Madrigal's Guide to Spanish, something like that. And they started by saying, look, as an adult, there are 7,000 words in Spanish that are almost identical to English. And having a reasonable grasp of English grammar, certainly a technical grasp that a 7-year-old didn't have, and having a reasonably large vocabulary, and again, a much larger vocabulary than a 7-year-old would have had, I missed out on certain things, but I got up to conversational speed in quite difficult topics. I could talk in a bar quite quickly about philosophy or things by leveraging my English vocabulary in a way that quite simply a young person couldn't. So I think this topic of age is a myth. There's obviously elements of truth to it, but it's an excuse, it's a crutch, it's a way of saying, well, I'm happy in my English-speaking bubble. I'm happy in my, physical decrepitude. I'm scared to break out of my professional circumstances and learn something radically new as I get a little bit older. And that's, I think, at the heart of the excuse that is I'm too old is fear. You know, I'm too old really means I'm too comfortable or I'm too scared. And that's what we have to challenge ourselves with. Anyway, that's a start of a very deep topic. I mean, there's books and all sorts of stuff spoken and written about this. I'd love to hear what you have to say. So feel free to write a comment, and I look forward to hearing from you. And if not, until next week, ciao.